Hi everyone, I'm Connor Rogers, content producer for Mining Indaba. I'm delighted to be joined by Edward Bickham, Senior Advisor to the World Gold Council. Edward, delighted to have you here.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Connor.
So Edward, I wanted to ask, why does artisanal and small-scale gold mining matter to large miners? And what does the World Gold Council, what are they doing in this space?
So in relation to the first half of the question, it matters because around 20% of global newly mined gold production comes from the ASM sector. And that's not something where everyone can look the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's grown a lot in the last 20 years. It can be responsible for some really quite damaging impacts. And so the industry as a whole needs to think about how to maximize the developmental impacts, and certainly one should say it employs probably in the region of 15 million people. So it's an important source of livelihoods, but we really do need, as an industry, to work with governments and others to reduce the adverse environmental impacts, address some of the social problems that go with it, and certainly improve the rule of law issues around it. In terms of what the World Gold Council is doing, I should say it probably goes into three main buckets. One is we work with our member companies in terms of helping them to be familiar with what good practice looks like, share good ideas. Secondly, to work with other agencies such as the World Bank, such as the United Nations, such as the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, to look at the policy environment and to try and ensure that as far as possible, it is possible for ASM and large-scale mining to have non-conflictual coexistence models. So, for example, in Suriname, took several years for Newmont to talk to the Surinamese government about changing their mining concession so as to enable them to work with rather than against the ASM groups there. So an example of good practice there. And thirdly, and it's a topic we might come on to talk about, we're working with a number of central banks on looking at how they can use the purchase power where they buy in gold from artisanal miners to produce better joined up government.
Thanks, Edward. That was really interesting. I'd like to touch maybe a bit more on your last point around central banks and understand the relevance of artisanal and small-scale gold mining to central banks and what the World Gold Council and others are doing to leverage the influence of central banks to improve the operating environment for responsible small-scale miners.
Right. So a number of countries, developing countries in particular, have programs whereby they buy material from small-scale miners, and they buy it in soft domestic currency, and it finds its way onto their balance sheets in hard currency in the end. So there are good reserve asset management reasons for them doing it. Now, we produced a report in 2021 that said, but if you're going to be doing these purchase programs, why not be more creative? Why not use them to reinforce some of your other mining policy objectives? So in many situations, the management of ASM is a bit of an orphan function within governments. So work with the central bank and the mining agency to help with formalization. If you're formalized, it was then easier for the central bank to buy from you. If you are wanting to try and achieve your objectives in relation to mercury reduction, introduce tests to try and ensure that the gold you're buying isn't tainted with mercury. So you're getting an environmental objective there. And also, in many cases, central banks also regulate commercial banks. One of the problems for trying to develop a responsible ASM sector is they find it very difficult to get finance. So if they can get finance, clean finance from commercial banks rather than from dodgy sources, then that also may help to clean up the process. So what are we doing? We're having produced this report using 4 case studies. We've then started a dialogue with a number of central banks, and they asked us to convene a working group, initially of 6 central banks, 2 in Asia, 2 in Africa, 2 in Latin America, in Paris earlier this year. They are committed to develop a number of best practice principles, which we hope to get signed off in October of this year. We're currently out for consultation around what those principles say and what it will require. And then they will be working together, sharing good practice, because getting joined up government, we know in the UK or the US, that's not always easy to get different ministries to work together. To get them to, in developing countries where there isn't a lot of government capacity, it can be very challenging. So learning how to do it well, being smart.
You talk there about quite a few challenges that you're having to overcome. So what would you say is the importance of this initiative that you're doing at the minute?
Well, one of the challenges, because a lot of artisanal mining is small scale and widely distributed and fragmented, it's quite difficult for them to discharge the expectations of large scale refineries who have to tick a number of important boxes in relation to due diligence that shows that the gold they're buying isn't tainted with conflict or human rights abuses. So finding ways in which small scale miners can meet those expectations is a challenge. If you're dealing with a central bank, if it can show the refiners that as a reputable organization, it is buying either directly or through licensed aggregators, bringing production together, you can begin to get economies of scale. And that helps then to mean that the artisanal material is going to licit rather than illicit refineries, and therefore finding its way into the mainstream bullion market.
You touched on large-scale miners there a few times. What would you say large-scale miners can do to support artisanal and small-scale miners, and do you think they're really doing enough?
So there are a number of things, and of course, what ASM looks like varies a huge amount from site to site. In some cases, where it's associated with armed groups, organized crime, whatever, that's a major challenge for governments and for companies. But given that most ASM, even if it's not in the formal sector, is not irresponsible in terms of its intentions, large-scale miners have an interest in trying to improve the operating environment around them, because they're interested in the longer-term development outcomes of their activities. And ASM is an important part of rural livelihoods. So if they can help small-scale miners to be environmentally responsible, to cut out mercury, to interact with the refineries and find their way into legitimate gold markets, that is improving the operating environment around them. If you can work with them to improve safety performance or to deal with the risk of child labour, that again is something that's clearly of interest to large-scale miners. And for some LSM companies, it's a challenge to understand what the dynamics of ASM around them are, to understand who the key players are, how the value gets distributed, whether there are malign rather than benign actors involved. And so there are a variety of ways that companies need to understand who they're dealing with. In some cases, if, for example, there are areas of their concession that they know they're not going to be using, but which have mineralization, not of interest to industrial mining but to ASM, then they can either think, depending on how the regulatory system works in that country, they can think about working with government to create artisanal mining corridors or subcontracting some small-scale mining activities. So there are a whole number of ways in which they can work together. Are they doing enough? In many cases, they are. We produced a report last year that involved 25 case studies from 15 companies from 18 countries. And that provides a large number of templates that others can work with.
A very interesting summary there, Edward. I'd like to discuss a few of the things that you've discussed over the past few minutes. Specifically, you mentioned the importance of formalisation. Why is this important, and why do many governments say they favour formalisation but then fail to deliver it?
So another key statistic to think about is that of the 15 million or so artisanal miners, probably in the region of 80% are working outside formal legal structures. That doesn't mean they're all criminals. It means, though, that they are lacking legal status. That makes it difficult for large-scale miners to work with them because there may be an element of illegality. So if they can get formal status, if they have proper permits, that gives them rights of tenure. It gives them a status that makes it possible for them to borrow from the mainstream banking system. And it potentially gives them a platform from which they can work with government to ensure that government actually enforces the law and the government provides them with services. There are a number of challenges with formalisation, but we think it's the foundation stone. By giving people status and rights, you can then build on that. In terms of why do governments say they favour it, which virtually every government of a developing country will say, but it doesn't happen much. That's partly because in some countries it's a long and complicated, it's not a user-friendly way of signing up. In some cases, the government lacks capacity and there isn't a one-stop shop for getting miners formalised, or they have to go 500 miles across the country and sit for 3 days to get formalised. So sometimes also the world falls on the head of the small-scale miner who gets formalised. Suddenly they find that they're besieged by environmental permits and other requirements. And so all the incentives suddenly work in the wrong direction and discourage formalisation. So what I think we need is for governments to be supported by donor agencies like the World Bank, like national groups like GIZ from Germany, to produce formalisation models that are user-friendly and realistic in terms of economic actors. That, if you have formalised, can then help coexistence between large-scale and small-scale miners. It can certainly then help them to access downstream actors, refineries, and generally help to strengthen the rule of law and regulatory systems. But governments need to really take the lead because it's very difficult to improve the overall environmental and social context for ASM without that government leadership.
It's very interesting stuff. You mentioned towards the end there the relationship with the downstream. Do you think artisanal mining has good enough links with the downstream, and do you think the downstream itself is doing enough in this regard?
So linkages are often quite poor, and that is often because small-scale miners are very small, they're very fragmented and widely distributed. So it's quite difficult if you're one of the major 6 or 7 international refineries to understand the dynamics around a particular small-scale site. What we need to do, or what the refineries need to do in particular, is to find ways of aggregating, whilst not losing sight of the importance of due diligence at key sites, but aggregating the material so it then reaches a sufficient scale for it to be commercially interesting. At the moment, artisanal gold accounts for 20% of newly mined production. But in terms of the LBMA London Good Delivery List refineries, the top of the market ones, 0.3% of their throughput comes directly from artisanal. So that, and the LBMA is committed to trying to improve that. The World Gold Council, along with a number of other actors, is working with the LBMA to think about countries and models where these issues can be better addressed.
Yeah, very good summation. I'd like to change the focus slightly towards the end, if you don't mind, to look at something that's discussed a lot within the Mining Indaba Sustainability Committee, and that's post-mine closure. But something that we haven't particularly had much insight on is the role of ASM in post-mine closure. So I'd be very interested to get your thoughts around that topic.
It's an evolving area of thinking. So just to present a problem, if you are a large-scale miner, your mine is coming to the end of its life. You invest a lot in decommissioning, re-landscaping, putting things in order, thinking about what you might do with water supply, electricity supply, and generally presenting it to the government to discharge your responsibilities for closure. Now, in a situation where you have a lot of small-scale miners around who may not have tenure in their own areas, although most of the mineralization may have already been mined out, there is still quite often a bit of gold around, which, if you're interested in small quantities, is still attractive to the small miners. So there is sometimes a danger that the company pays all that money, gets decommissioning done, gets the government ready to sign off that you've done what you should do, and suddenly the area becomes invaded by small-scale miners who then rip it all up again. So that clearly isn't going to result in a sustainable outcome. So there are a few, but at this stage only a few examples where companies have been working with their local ASM to provide continued access to areas of mineralization, potentially access to some machinery, and to negotiate areas that can be exploited and areas that cannot. Critical there to have the involvement of government, as in many other things we've talked about today, so that government can hold the ring and make certain that any agreement is then adhered to. But actually trying to have a cooperative end to mine life on the social and environmental side is really important, and ASM may be an important dimension to that.
It's a fascinating aspect of post-mine closure that I don't think is focused on enough. So very interesting insight. Edward, I want to say thank you for giving such an expert analysis of the artisanal mining space, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for watching. I look forward to seeing you all at Mining Indaba in February to continue the discussion.